So this month's presentation will be on migration, which I know a lot of people are dealing with if you're moving from other types of sites. So before we actually begin the presentation, I want to do some housekeeping. Most of you all know what Drupal for Gov is. We are a community of open source advocates interested in all things open source. And so in addition to this monthly webinar, which we hold every third Thursday at 3 o'clock, we also have our yearly conference, Drupal GovCon 2020. Due to the pandemic and COVID, it will be online. Dates aren't finalized, but once we have that, we will let you know. We also do Drupal global training days, and we've kind of halted on that for now due to the pandemic and COVID. Once that starts, we will communicate that. And I don't know if any of you all have attended DrupalCon this week. We assist with that. So hopefully some of you all were able to participate in that. And if you're interested in any information, if you're even interested in presenting, please reach out to us on Slack. We have a workspace there, and also on Twitter. And please email us at the email you see listed. If you've missed the webinar, we upload all of our webinars to YouTube. And in addition, please check Drupal for Gov, the webinar page, where we also list the various webinars. And so our next webinar will be on the Drupal GovCon website. So behind the curtain, Mike Madison is the solutions architect for that, and he will be presenting. A lot of interesting tools are used: Lando, Behat, Drush, Webform, Config Split. So if you're interested in those types of technologies or just learning more about that website, please join us in May. And last but not least, I'm happy to introduce David Cameron. He currently works for DS Federal as a senior Drupal developer, supporting the National Agricultural Library. He specializes in solution architecting and data migrations, which is what we're going to talk about today. He's a veteran of 4 North American DrupalCons and a 3-time new contributor mentor. He's an active member of the Oklahoma Drupal Users Group, where he frequently presents, and he maintains 3 modules on Drupal.org. So please check him out on Drupal.org. His username is DCAM, and he lives in Midwest Oklahoma with his wife and 5 cats. So David, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to make you, I'm also going to let these, there are a lot of people I need to let in. I'm going to make you host. And now you should have the ability to share your screen.
There we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. You know how I get rid of the, oops, the zoom toolbar at the top? Or is that even possible?
Yeah, there's I can't remember all. There's a way.
There we go. Okay. That's a little better. Hi, everybody. Welcome to my presentation about migrations in Drupal 8. Thank you for coming to watch me today, as opposed to going to see DrupalCon, which is going on right now. I kind of feel like I'm on a cable network opposite the Super Bowl. And what we're going to be talking about, as previously mentioned, is migrations. And this is mostly about my best practices that I use every day, basically. Migrations is something that I do a whole lot of. And I want to pass along knowledge to you about things that I do, and also some complications that someone who's new to migrations in Drupal 8 might encounter as they are exploring the field and testing things out. It can be a little bit of a complex thing to sink your teeth into, not knowing exactly what to do. And I want to remove some of those barriers for you and help, like it says here on the title slide, help you make informed decisions about using Migrate. So that's what this is all about here today. As previously mentioned, my name is David Cameron, and I do work for DS Federal, contracted with the National Agricultural Library, where I have worked for 10 years as of this month. I am a senior Drupal developer, and I manage somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 Drupal 7 and 8 websites. I don't have an exact count because that number goes up and down quarterly as we consolidate sites and spin new ones up. So I don't really remember how many sites I'm actually in charge of, but that'll come up again later. The fact that I do have to manage and maintain so many sites affects the way that I have to do migrations, specifically going from 7 to 8. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Is the Zoom toolbar covering up the title of the slide for you all, Nika?
Nope, you're fine.
Popping up for me, covering up the title. So I'm glad it isn't affecting all of you. I think I skipped over a slide. I totally skipped over a slide. There we go. So if any of you have been attending Drupal for Gov webinars for a while, you may wonder, how is this different from the February 2020 webinar, which was also about migrations? And it's going to be completely different from that. That one was about preparing for a migration and doing essentially content auditing in preparation for that. Mine is going to be a little more technical, geared mostly towards site builders and developers. I'm sorry if that disappoints some of you. I tried to work in some non-developer content. Hopefully everyone will get something out of this. But we are going to talk about actually executing migrations, different types of migrations that you can do. It's not just used for going from 7 or 6 to 8 or 9. And so you might wonder why talk about this at all. I've actually given this presentation a few times over the years to my local user group. And the reason why is because the landscape of migrations has continued to evolve throughout the Drupal 8 life cycle. With Drupal 8.3, we had a change to the API that altered how things are done within add-on modules and custom modules. There has been some conflicts between core developers and contrib developers within the Migrate space. There's multiple modules that do the same thing. And so as my own techniques have developed over the years, I've passed that information along to other developers who have found it useful. And that's why I picked this topic for my first ever webinar here on Drupal for Gov. Just so you know, throughout this presentation, I'm probably going to be saying Drupal 8 quite a bit. And that's partly because of how I work. We only have Drupal 8 sites right now because some of the contrib modules we use aren't Drupal 9 ready. But when I do say Drupal 8, I really mean Drupal 8 or Drupal 9 because they're essentially, Drupal 9 is essentially just the next version of 8. I did check out all of the modules that I'm going to be talking about today, and every single one of them has a Drupal 9 compatible version. So you shouldn't need to worry about that. Just work with that caveat with me, please. If I say Drupal 8, I do mean also Drupal 9. The very first tip that I want to give to all of you as we're starting out, this is my #1 thing that I tell everybody. If you are looking for migrate related information online, please try to look for the most up-to-date information that you can. Now, you may say, well, duh, I mean, that figures, but it's especially important because of what I mentioned about the API change that has happened during the Drupal 8 life cycle. If you are looking for information and Googling and looking at Stack Overflow or blog posts, and you are reading information from, say, 2015 or 16, prior to that change, it may be out of date and may be completely useless to you at this point. Whenever I am Googling information, and I still occasionally have to, I always look for a timestamp on any blog posts or the Stack Overflow and try to get an idea of when that information was written. And if it's old, then I move along, and so should you. Please, make sure that you're getting the most current information possible. If you can't verify how old it is, compare it to the official documentation on Drupal.org, which is pretty up to date, and see whether or not it's giving good info. But that's the most important thing for everybody to learn from this. Let's start off next by talking about the different types of migrations that you can do. A lot of people seem to think that the Migrate module is really only for upgrading Drupal from 6 or 7 to 8 or 9, and that's not true. It is something that's very important, and it's why the Migrate module was added to Drupal 8 core. It became the backbone of the Drupal 8 upgrade system, as opposed to using update hooks, which is what we were doing previously in Drupal 6 and 7. But there's more that you can do with it, a whole lot more. And I use it for all of these things that you see here on the screen in the course of my work. I do perform upgrades from 7 to 8. And we're going to dive into that first once we start talking about modules here today. But you can also use it for moving information from one Drupal 8 site to another. Oddly enough, that's one of the most difficult things to do that's on this list, is going from one D8 site to another. I'm in the process of merging one Drupal 8 site into another right now, and having to write a whole lot of custom code for it, because right now core doesn't support that. You have to create custom migrations in order to do it. The next thing that you can do with it is do data transformations. Oddly enough, this is a whole lot easier than going from one D8 site to another, because Drupal core does support the ability to take information from one entity type within Drupal 8 and port that data over to a different one. It's something that I've occasionally had to do, say for one site where something was set up as a taxonomy, but we decided later on it was really better off written as a node. And so we used this plugin that's available with Drupal core in order to make that happen, along with a migration. And then the last thing that you can do is import data from various formats. SQL, XML, JSON, CSV. We actually have a JSON migration where I do a lot of work for the Food Safety Research Information Office at the library, and they track food safety research data all over the globe. And we import data via a third-party program and aggregate it to aggregate all that data together and output it as a JSON feed, which is then migrated into the Drupal 8 website using a custom migration. So this is something that I do all the time, and can be extremely useful. Unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot of other examples ready for that to describe to you, but it's something that's a very powerful way to get data into your Drupal 8 website. Now, in Drupal 7, we probably would have used something like the feeds module in order to accomplish that. And I don't know how ready it is to be able to do that for Drupal 8 right now. If you're thinking about that, if you're using feeds in order to do that for your Drupal 7 site, I know that it is still in the alpha stage. And when we really started doing a lot of data migration in Drupal 8, it was determined that feeds was really not production ready and not something that we could rely on. So I haven't studied it and kept up to date with what's going on with feeds. Okay, the next thing that I want to talk about in order to eliminate some confusion that may be going on is talk about a little bit of terminology. I'm going to be throwing around the word plugin quite a bit during this presentation. And unfortunately, plugin can refer to two different things, or four, depending on how you think about it. You can see them up here on the screen. Hopefully you can see them well enough to read them, but if you're not, it's not that important that you see the contents. Over on the left-hand side, we have an example of a migration plugin. This is a YAML file that you include in a custom module. There are plenty of them in core as well, responsible for doing the upgrading from Drupal 6 or 7, that defines a migration, where the data comes from and where it's going to and how it gets there in between. The other example here is the source or process or destination plugins. These are PHP files that define a connection or, as the name suggests, a process for transforming data during the migration. Mostly what we're going to be talking about today is the migration plugins that are on the left-hand side of the screen, because these are a little bit easier to understand, and this is just a little bit more advanced, and we're not going to try and get into that today, the source, process, and destination plugins. But you can also see, if you are able to read this, that we do have in this section, in this YAML file, sections labeled source and process, and there would be another one called destination further on down. And so this YAML file is calling these plugins over here. They're both referred to as plugins. If it's not clear which type of plugin I'm talking about, please feel free to ask in chat, and Nico will let me know. And I can try and clarify that for you, just in case it's not clear. One other thing to note is that my voice is a little hoarse today because of all the pollen in the air, so I'm going to be taking occasional drinks of water. All right, let's move on, and I believe we're going to get started talking about core modules. If you don't know, the Migrate module, that was a contrib module in Drupal 7 and earlier, I assume, was put into Drupal 8 for the purpose of migrating Drupal 6 and 7 sites to Drupal 8. The Migrate module provides the base API for all migrations. And then there are a couple of other modules that are included within Drupal core to facilitate upgrades from 6 and 7 to 8. The first one that provides all of those migrations is labeled simply Migrate to Drupal. And then there is a second module, or third on the list, called Migrate Drupal UI, that provides the wizard that allows you to run all these migrations through the user interface. These are all really fantastic modules, and I encourage you all to use them. I want to let you know I use Migrate Drupal and Migrate Drupal UI on every single Drupal 7 to 8 migration that I do, because they are so useful for me. And I am actually going to, I'm actually going to do a live demo, dangerous as that is, in order to show it to you, because I believe this is very important. And I know, or assume rather, that a lot of you are here because maybe you have Drupal 7 sites that need to get ported into Drupal 8 in the coming months before Drupal 7 support ends. So I want to share this with you and give you an idea of what to expect and why I like these modules so much. Here I have a almost vanilla fresh install of Drupal 9 running here on my local machine. And what I've done is I've installed the Migrate Drupal and Migrate Drupal UI modules here on this site. And we're going to run through a migration real quick, because at least here on my local, coming from the Drupal 7 site that I have set up, there's only a few nodes, so it runs really quickly. The first thing that I'm going to do is go in the path to /upgrade, and it will bring up this administrative screen. Ignore the security update warning at the top, and gives you a quick rundown of exactly what it's going to do, and advice, such as backing up the database, enabling all modules that need to be enabled on the D9 site. I'm going to click continue to go through it, or into it, And on this next screen, it provides you with a form where you can configure the upgrade in order to take data from the D7 site to the D9 site. You can provide it with your credentials. In this case, just the Drupal 7 database name, which is just Drupal 7. If you have files on the D7 site, you can supply the paths for those file directories here. I don't, it's just a very simple site. And then I'm going to click Review Upgrade. It's going to give me a warning here real quick, and I'm going to ignore it. It's talking about how there's translations on the D7 site, and I may lose data. That's fine with me right now. And then on this next page is something that is one of my favorite things about doing this Migrate Drupal UI, is it provides you with this report that tells you what may be missing from your D9 site that's on your D7 site. Here you can see that I failed to enable any translation modules here on my D9 site. And it even tells me exactly which ones I'm missing. I'm missing the content translation module. I'm gonna ignore that for now, just for the sake of demonstration. If you're interested in seeing modules that do have to find upgrades, then you can expand this and it'll give you the entire list of modules that are ready to be upgraded here. And I'm going to click Perform Upgrade, and it's going to run. It takes about 30 seconds or so, during which you'll notice that it actually provides you with a running log of all the migrations that are being run during this. They tend to go by so fast that it's not really that useful, but that's okay. It's one of those things that's nice to have. Once it's finished, what's going to happen is that it will put all of this information from these status messages into the site log, where it can be reviewed by you in order to see what happened during the migration. You can see here the standard Drupal message saying that it had 78 upgrade tasks complete successfully, and congratulations, we upgraded Drupal. Fantastic. And so I'm going to review the log to see if that actually is true. And I happen to know, because I did this 2 or 3 times this morning, that there are going to be a few problems here. Here we have some errors related to an invalid translation language, which we know that I failed to install the content translation module, so that figures. We also see a couple of errors about the shortcut sets, and then further on down, some more errors about translation. So this is my second favorite thing about using the Migrate Drupal UI module whenever I'm preparing to migrate a Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 site, because it allows me to know, at a glance, at 2 different stages, what happened during a hypothetical migration, and what do I need to watch out for? What do I need to maybe write some custom code for to make it go right, or simply make some adjustments on the D7 side in order to help this go smoothly. And so I absolutely recommend using it. But this also points at another point that I want to make. Nearly everybody who I talk to whenever they run migrations is nobody runs migrations only one time. It's usually a very iterative process. I don't think I've ever run a migration only once. You run a migration, you see what happened, and then you run the migration, again and again and again until it's exactly the way you want it. The developers that I've talked to about this tend to go through the same stages of development, and whenever they're first starting out. If you think about that with this site, we migrated all the data in, but there's no rollback button for this anywhere. And so in order to rerun the migration and get, test out changes and fixes for things, you have to reinstall the entire site from scratch. And that's slow. Most people figure out that they can simply install the Drupal 9 site, get it set up exactly the way they want, and then back up the database. And whenever they're retesting a migration, they simply restore that backup. It's, having taken a snapshot of it, exactly the perfect state where they wanted it. But even that gets cumbersome, especially if you're migrating a very large site, because the migration itself can take a long time. That migration that I just ran for you took about 30 seconds. But I can tell you that I migrated a site last month that had about 16,000 nodes, and it took somewhere on the order of 12 to 15 minutes, depending on the speed of the connection to the database. And so you don't want to have to go through that every single time. And that makes this a perfect segue into migration running. What you can do in order to execute migrations through the command line. And I'm sorry for all of you who hate using the command line, but Drush is the fastest way to run migrations and not through the user interface. And it's also a whole lot more convenient if you need to do testing. So I am going to show some examples of that in the command line, but let's take a look at the more popular migration runners that are out there. The first one, the first one that was created rather, is Migrate Tools. It originally just provided Drush commands for executing migrations, but it now features an administrative UI that I only learned about a couple of days ago and haven't actually played with today. So I'm sorry, I can't really talk about it or demonstrate it because I just don't have the experience with it. It is dependent on the Migrate Plus module, which isn't necessarily a plus, a benefit to Migrate Tools. And in fact, that's why I tend to avoid it. My favorite one that I use and have for a few years now is called Migrate Run. It was a fork of Migrate Tools that removed the dependency on Migrate Plus. And we'll be talking more about Migrate Plus later. It also provides Drush commands, but does not have the same administrative user interface. It was never added from Migrate Tools. It was forked from an earlier version. And the two of them are not compatible with each other. You should not install them together because they actually provide the exact same commands. I don't know what would happen if you installed them at the same time. Hopefully there's something that would prevent you from doing that, but I don't know. The other migration runner that I have used, but don't use most of the time, is Migrate Manifest. And it's very handy because you can write a YAML file that contains a list of migrations that you want to run, and then tell it, okay, execute this manifest, and it will do all of those migrations in order for you. Very, very handy if you have a long list of migrations and you don't want to manually type out the commands for them every single time. You just stick them in the manifest file and let it take over. It is compatible with Migrate Tools and Migrate Run as far as I know, so you can execute migrations with Migrate Manifest and then do more with them later on with, say, Migrate Run if you want. So I'm going to switch back over to my command line real quick so that you all can see some things that I want to show off with this. So let's look at the migrations that are available in this Drupal 9 site by executing the Drush migrate status command, or Drush ms. And I'm actually going to filter the migrations by giving it the name of a tag, and I only want migrations from Drupal 7. What the migrate status command does is it prints out this list of all the migrations that it found within the system. There are some errors up here. I'm not concerned about them. That's because the migration still looks for tables in the old Drupal 7 site, even though they don't exist. And these are from modules that I simply don't have enabled, like the user profile module. It gives you an output of how many records it found on the Drupal 7 site, how many of them actually imported, how many are left to be processed for whatever reason. So it's very handy. And this is one of the points that I want to make, is that if you're executing the Migrate Drupal migrations within the Drupal user, the Migrate Drupal user interface, These are all just regular migrations like you might write a custom migration for. And there's nothing special about any of them except for maybe one or two, namely the file migration, which has to have a file path to get from. But most of these can be executed and run individually, or if there's something wrong, like we talked about, you make a change and you want to rerun the migration, you can simply tell it, I want to revert, or roll back the migration. So here I have a Drupal D7 node complete recipe migration that has been run. There was something wrong with it. You can see that there were 3 total records, but only 2 of them got imported. And that's because of the content translation problem that we saw in the log. So I'm going to pretend that I fixed that problem, and I'm going to roll that migration back. Drush MR is the shortcut for it, and give it the migration name, and it'll roll back that migration for me. Let's say I fix the problem, and then I can re-import it by giving it the import command, the shortcut for which is drush mim. Now, I didn't actually fix the problem, so it's still telling me that I had one node that failed to be imported. That is kind of the step beyond, where people are re-importing the database and they never take the step beyond that. How else can they optimize and be more efficient when they're developing migrations? And it's simply by using a migration runner like this. So we already talked about the first 3 commands. Migrate status shows you obviously the status of all the migrations that are in your system. Migrate import imports a specific migration or migrations. Rollback rolls them back. The last 2, stop, migrate stop will cleanly stop a migration that is in progress. Let's say you have, for whatever reason, you have to kill a long-running migration in order to go off and do something else for a little while. You can issue the stop command and it will stop the migration. You can pick it up again later. The last one, reset status, is mostly used, at least by me, when something has gone wrong. Let's say there was a PHP error in one of the plugins, process plugins that I was using. Then it would freeze the migration import process, and then I would actually have to issue the reset status command in order to get that working again. Okay, let's talk about the Migrate Plus module. And this is one where that I specifically want to talk about because it's almost a little bit controversial. It is a fantastic module, but it isn't necessary in all situations. It was developed early on in the Drupal 8 life cycle and does 2 really important or interesting things. Number 1 is it allows migrations to be configuration entities. So they can be saved as configuration part of your site. When you export your configuration and then you back it up to GitHub, that sort of thing, as opposed to being a plugin part of a module. And this was done to solve an issue that Drupal core did not want to deal with, where Drupal core really doesn't support any kind of configurable entities, and where you can say you can have a form that allows you to dynamically set options within a migration. And so Migrate Plus was partly created in order to provide that. It also serves as kind of a storage spot for a lot of different source, process, and destination plugins, and many of which are incredibly useful. And it's a great module for doing that. And if you can't find the kind of process plugin that you want to use or source plugin within Drupal core, because Drupal core only provides source plugins for Drupal database sources or SQL database, and ignoring any other possible import scenarios, like say from my JSON feeds that we talked about earlier. My module that imports that JSON feed from the third-party source has to rely on or depend on Migrate Plus in order to get that done, because Migrate Plus provides a JSON source plugin for that. And let's see, these other source plugins that it provides are XML, JSON, I think SOAP, and I don't remember what else. The process plugins that it provides, I think there's about a dozen of them. I'm not going to try and list them here. I don't remember them all anyway. As for destination plugins, I believe it provides the ability to migrate data into any arbitrary SQL table. And also, if you're just getting started in the Migrate space, then please check it out, because it also contains really, really helpful example modules. But here's the thing, and one of the points that I wanted to make in order to clarify some stuff that you may be reading online. If you're reading blog posts or Stack Overflow articles, and one of the first things that they advise you to do is install Migrate Plus, you should ask why. And a lot of the reason why is because Migrate Tools is dependent on it. And the author of that post may not have realized that there's an alternative that doesn't require a dependency on Migrate Plus. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to badmouth Migrate Plus. It is a fantastic module for what it does, but it's not necessary in all situations. And if I don't have to download it, then I don't. And so you should always look at a critical eye with anything that says you need to download Migrate Plus, and wonder whether or not it's actually necessary for your project. When should you use it? When you're doing something that requires configurable migrations. And if you're doing that, then you're probably a pretty good developer who's doing something incredibly custom. And aside from that, you can also do it whenever you need one of its plugins, like in my JSON example. And so, sorry, excuse me. If you need it, you can simply enable it, and then its plugins are available to you to use in your migrations with no problem at all. So these are the two requirements that I think of when I'm trying to decide whether or not I need the Migrate Plus module. Other Migrate modules, I do not have any experience with any of these, but I do know that they exist. And I tried to search for some other modules to see what might be out there in the Migrate module space. These were some of the top results. There's a Migrate Source CSV module that obviously allows you to import data from CSV files. There's a Migration Tools module, and while I don't know exactly what it does, the impression that I get is that it's kind of like Migrate Plus, where it provides neat extensions and useful extensions to the Migrate API. There is also the media migration module, which I wish I had had time to experiment with before this, but I simply didn't with my current workload, because I have a Drupal 7 to 8 site that I'm working on right now, where I'm going to have to work on migrating media. And that's something that Drupal core does not do right now, is it has no path for migrating media from 7 to 8. There are other situation-specific modules, say one that migrates information from WordPress to Drupal, and many more. So if you do if you have a specific use case, feel free to search for it and see if something for it pops up. That way you don't have to try and develop your own modules. Nika, this is a good stopping point for questions if we have any.
Yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Oh, this is just great so far. So well communicated. No.
Thank you.
I did have a question, but I don't know if I should wait till the end. This is I just had a question about a specific migration type, like of paragraph entities, for example. I wanted to gauge your experience. I mean, I've been trying to. I use all of the modules that and they're fantastic. I can attest to that. They make things so much easier. However, one big issue I've run into is the migration of paragraphs from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8/Drupal 9. And I was wondering if you had any experience managing that type of migration. But I don't know, again, if that is something I should wait till the end for you to answer.
Specifically, no. And I'll tell you why. And that's because we do not consider paragraphs to be a module that we like to use. And so we avoid it unless it's identified as being absolutely the best module for the situation, which isn't often. Usually we can find a way around that. It's because of a very specific bug with paragraphs that gives me pause for using it. So tell me, for a paragraphs migration, what does it have any sort of predefined migration that, whenever you're running a Drupal upgrade that it should be running but isn't? Or do you know
Yeah,
this?
I think it's a bug. So there is, I don't think there was a, and I haven't checked this in a couple of months. I've been following the Slack channel, the migration, but there is, I think, a bug with how nested paragraphs are handled. And I don't
Oh,
think the plugin, there's a plugin. So I might have to look into writing a custom plugin, but I don't know. I'm a little nervous about doing it. It
sure.
seems to be a little bit
And
up over
actually,
my
as you can
head.
probably see on my screen right now, we're about to talk a little bit about custom migrations.
Cool.
I wasn't going to get that in depth into it, like talking about referencing other entities, but I imagine that's going to be the key there is, you have one paragraph that references multiple others.
Hmm.
And so that gets into issues like, creating stub migrations, which is a thing. Basically, let's say you have an entity, say a node that you're importing, and it references a taxonomy term, but for whatever reason, that taxonomy term hasn't been imported
Hmm.
yet. In that case, Drupal will create a stub, kind of a placeholder entity within the system. And then later on, when the taxonomy term migration is run, then it replaces the information in that stub entity with the actual data. Um, I'm guessing that's the exact same sort of thing that will happen with a paragraph, inset paragraph like that, but I don't know. And I'm sorry, I have zero experience with it, primarily because we specifically avoid that.
Yeah,
Um,
lucky you.
David, two questions regarding this. Very simple. If we could, say in one sentence, what's the bug that both using paragraphs, because I'm using paragraphs a lot. And the second one is, you mentioned stubs or placeholder entities in migration. I get the concept of that. Can you elaborate a little bit on the stubs? Is something that you write as part of the custom migration, custom code, or how do you, or is that something that happens automatically?
Okay, so the first question that you had about the problem with paragraphs, um, and I have not experienced this personally, but I have heard a speaker that I respect quite a bit and was well acquainted with here in Oklahoma City, where I live, who basically wrote most of the original code for Layout Builder. And he also avoided using paragraphs because, and I believe it relates to the entity reference revisions module, not necessarily a bug with paragraphs itself, but paragraphs is dependent on entity reference revisions. And what he has seen happen multiple times, even with small sites, is that anytime you save an entity that has a paragraph field, every single paragraph that is inside of that field in reference has a revision for it saved on every single save of the node. And so if you have paragraphs that include other paragraphs, and you have a whole stack of them, then a revision of that gets saved for every single one. And he has seen databases fail because the entity reference revision tables just fill up the database with all kinds of garbage data that is never used by anyone ever. It just causes incredible database bloat, according to him. He says he's seen it multiple times. And so it's for that reason that we avoid using it. And
And I assume that, otherwise everyone will have done it. that you cannot. There's not a way currently in paragraphs that you can disable revision, and that's why it's causing that error.
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I'm sorry, everyone. I'm getting a little bit hoarse here. I'm gonna get a little bit more water.
And I also want to keep in mind the time. It's 3:45, so I want to.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I don't know any way around that with paragraphs because I simply don't use it, and we have become a layout builder using Development House because primarily because we're attached to the person who helped create it, and so I came to really like it.
That's Tim Plunkett.
No, actually, it's Chris Vanderwater.
Oh, okay.
Tim Plunkett did a whole lot of work on it too, but he and Chris are two of the people who really started it. So
that answers my question, David. So we
okay.
should probably burn more time on it. The second one, very quickly, was regarding to the migration placeholder entities or stubs.
Yeah, so as far as doing the placeholder stubs go, that is supposed to be handled automatically by the system. It does not require any intervention on your part when you're creating custom migrations.
Thank you.
No problem. All right, so let's talk about custom migrations briefly in the time we have left. If you're wanting to do anything custom, like say import things from a JSON data feed, as I have done, you will need to create a custom module. And for some of you, that may be a little bit of a scary prospect, but this is something that doesn't necessarily require any custom code or PHP code to do. If you are using plugins, by that I mean like source, process, and destination plugins that come out of the box with Drupal or with Migrate Plus. All you really need to have a migration module is what you see here in the image on my screen. Or you create a directory with a custom module. It has an info file. If you don't know how to create that, you can do it using examples that are available on Drupal.org. It only requires like 5 or 6 lines, really easy to write. And then you have a migration YAML file. It has to be located within a migrations directory. That's a requirement of Drupal core. So really only 2 things to define a migration module, and none of them involve PHP at all. This is a very simple example of a migration plugin file. To start out, you'll notice that the ID here is the same as the file name, and that's a requirement. So we have my custom migration.yaml here, and then we have the ID is my custom migration here. On the next line, you can see migration tags, which is a way that you can use using the migrate status command to filter migrations. Earlier, when I demonstrated on the command line, I put in Drupal 7 for the tag, and it filtered it down to only Drupal 7 related migrations. If I had left that off, it would have given us a whole bunch more errors because Drupal core also includes migrations for Drupal 6. So I was able to cut down on the amount of clutter in there, and you could do that too. I could put in a custom there and get back to this migration. And you give it a human readable name. And we're going to talk about these next 3 sections individually, the source, process, and destination sections of the file. And this simple migration is one for the situation that I described earlier, migrating content from a taxonomy term entity to a node entity within the same site. So we have a couple of examples of source plugin sections of the file here. This is the same one from the last page, where the plugin that we're using is the content entity plugin that comes with Drupal core. And then I tell it specifically by putting in that I want taxonomy terms by doing colon taxonomy term here. Here's a more complex example that I adapted from a migration that I wrote. This is the one for importing the JSON data feed, and it depends on the Migrate Plus and has a whole bunch more options. So for this, I tell it that the plugin that I want to use is its URL feed. I can give the plugin a URL, which I supply down here. And it will go fetch that using its HTTP fetcher plugin. This is also specific to Migrate Plus, and then parse the data using JSON. When it reads in that JSON, it will look for an items key within the JSON array, and then I give it a bunch of fields that I want to have available to me for processing within the migration. So, and then the list of fields goes on and on for a little while in the actual file. The simple example that I have over here can also have other options for it as well. For instance, I can tell it the specific bundle or vocabulary in taxonomy terms that I want to have it migrating from over here. But it can just be cut down to get all taxonomy terms in this case. So if you want to explore it more, there's the link to the documentation page on Drupal.org that will give you more information about the source plugins that are available. Destination plugins are typically no more complex than this. I have never imported data using Migrate into anything other than a Drupal 8 entity. And so typically this is all you need. It can also have additional options. For instance, you can give it a bundle key. If you want to import something into an article node, then you would give it the bundle key : articles here under the destination. And then finally, here is the process plugins. And this is the more complex thing to talk about. I'm going to jump back here real quick. I like to think of the migration plugins as being a map, just like a map, for getting, walking or driving from one place to another. You have the source, which is your start point. You have your destination, which is your endpoint. The process section is your instructions from getting from A to B, in a sense. And so here we have a slightly more complex example of the instructions that we are giving it in order to map data from one side to the other, and also to transform that data in some cases from one thing to another. Again, we're going with the example of moving content from taxonomy terms to nodes. So in this case, on the left-hand side here, we have the destination, the node title, and then the source field is the name of the taxonomy term. So this is the simplest example of something you do, just a one-to-one mapping. A slightly more complex example is on the line below it, where we have a body field. Now, body fields are kind of a multi-valued field where you have the actual value, but you also have other data in there in terms of the text format. If you want basic HTML or full HTML or restricted HTML. And so we specifically want the description of the taxonomy term to go into the body field's value. And so we delineate that using the slash character. Same thing down here on the next line where we're doing it with the format. But in this case, we're not doing a one-to-one mapping. We're utilizing a different process plugin in the form of a default value, where we don't necessarily want anything from the D7 side or the taxonomy side being mapped in there. We just want it to always be restricted HTML. And then the final example here on this slide is an example of another plugin. There are maybe a few different process plugins on between core and the Migrate Plus module. This is just an example of 3 of them or 4. In this case, the plugin that we want to use is a static map. I'm pretending that we have an old Boolean field on the taxonomy terms, and we want it to be mapping to a text field on the example nodes. And so for that, we define a map down here. If the source data is 0, then we want to enter text of no into the new node field. If it's 1, then we want to enter yes. These are just a few simple examples, and you can find documentation for all of the process plugins that are available on Drupal.org. They generally have very good documentation and examples for how you use them. So we are almost out of time, and want to open it up for questions now.
I see, so someone, Ray Yick, he asked, what is the benefits of using Migrate Run over Migrate Tools?
the benefit of using Migrate Run over Migrate Tools, in my opinion, is not needing to use Migrate Plus, include that. It may be a minor thing and not necessarily a concern of yours, but I just try to avoid using Migrate Plus if I don't have to, just like we should generally do for all modules in order to, you know, prevent us from having, you know, potential extra security issues, extra, you know, performance issues, that sort of thing. That's all it's about. I would say that at this point, Migrate Tools is a little bit more fully featured and does have that user interface. If you like user interfaces, download Migrate Tools. Go ahead. I believe that they have done really good work in the past. And as I said, Migrate Run is based off of it. It's just that I would rather use it personally than Migrate Tools.
And then I think when you were talking about paragraphs, Stacy Muse asked, what's the bug with paragraphs? And I think it addressed the bloated database, maybe?
Yeah, it was the database bloat issue where it saves a revision for every single paragraph that's loaded on that page anytime you save the node. And so if you have nodes that are getting saved, you know, saved and resaved all the time, if you have paragraphs that reference other paragraphs that reference other paragraphs and so on, and you may have a huge stack of paragraphs, which I'm told is a thing that people actually do, then it can cause you to rack up tens, hundreds, thousands, millions of database rows that are completely unnecessary and have caused databases to crash. And it's not something that's widely talked about among the community. But I've never seen it happen, but I know people who have.
And Ray Ricks says, thanks, David. How would you suggest we handle special filtering or exclusion of data before they are migrated to a new site? For example, a client is asking we not migrate content that is created before a specific date. How should we handle that?
That's a great question. The way that I typically do it, because it's fastest, is simply to, let me back up here. I would add a .module file here to my custom module. And what I would do is add the hook prepare row function to that module. And in that, anytime that a row of data is being migrated, it will be supplied to that hook, and then you can inspect its properties, the values that are in that row of data. And at that point, you can either choose to let it on through, modify the data, or you can instruct the migrate module to skip that row. And I don't know how fast I can get to it, but I do have an example of that in one of my modules here, and I don't mind showing you. Yes, this is actually the module that I wrote in order to migrate the taxonomy terms to nodes, and I had to do that for this. Nope, this is not where I do it. Sorry. But it is an example of the hook prepare row. This specifically does something with translations here. But if you want to throw away rows, then there is a specific type of exception that you can throw within a function like this. And it's I believe it's just simply entitled the migrate skip row exception. And it tells the migrate API that it should stop trying to migrate this row and move on to the next one. It won't cause the migrate module to crash. It will simply cause it to move on. Great question.
Any more questions?
Shall we have the presentation recorded, uploaded somewhere to Drupal for GOV?
Yes, we will upload it tonight, and it will be shared along with the survey that goes out.
All right, so we'll get an email notification.
Yes.
Thank you, David. This was an amazing presentation, by the way.
No problem. I am glad that some of you enjoyed it.
One question I had really quickly is, what's the best way to test or verify if a migration was successful or not? Beyond the log message, like, what do you do? What's your workflow for testing the successful running of a migration
Okay.
progress?
I suppose in the end, I do a whole lot of kind of manual stuff. I talked a little bit earlier about doing iterative migrations, and whenever I'm doing anything custom, that is how I perform it. I add bits of migration one thing at a time. If I'm migrating an entity from one thing to another, then I will get the title working, and once that's up and running, then I move on to the body field and so on. Not doing everything all at once is the best way to not mess up and being able to catch errors as they occur. As far as running debugging processes during it, I'm blanking on the best way to do it right now, and I'm sorry. You can, let's say you have developed a custom plugin during that, and you're executing migrations through the command line, as I did with Drush. Then in your custom plugin, you can always dump the variables. I know that may be old school and not the way people like to do it, but it is, frankly, I do a whole lot of var dumping
Me too.
whenever I'm doing development. And so it will output the whatever's going on into the command line as you're going along, as it's doing the migration. And that's typically how I catch things. I want to say that there is a better way to do it, but I am totally blanking on what that is at the moment. I'm sorry.
No need to apologize. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much. I really appreciate the feedback.
Well, thank you, David, for being our presenter for April.
No problem.
That's such a popular topic. And so thank you also, everybody, for joining. Please join us next month where we talk about Drush, Behat, Lando, BLT, Acquia's development environment. So everybody, thank you again and stay safe.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks everyone for listening.